Hi, I'm Caitlin, a podcast producer here at C-SPAN. This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, New York Times correspondent David Sanger discusses China's rise, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and America's role in the world in the 21st century. Harvard University Belfer Center senior fellow Paula Dobriansky interviews him.
Since March 19, 1979, C-SPAN, a public service funded by the cable television industry, began giving you direct access to government in an innovative way by putting you, the viewer, into the rooms where politics is debated and policies are determined. C-SPAN began as a bold initiative. Now, 45 years later, we are essential for those wanting to see democracy at work, without editing or commentary. With continued cable support, we've done this without a dime of government funding, maintaining our independence. As we mark 45 years, the business of media is rapidly changing, and now your support is crucial for our mission's future. Support our legacy of unfiltered access by donating today at cspan.org/donate. Thank you.
David, congratulations on your book, New Cold Wars: China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. I read this book, and it's outstanding. Yeah, truly a masterpiece, truly amazing. I felt, as being a former government official, someone who was inside the sit room, inside or on the phone with all the different policymakers. I mean, just every detail here jumps out at you. But I love, and he puts it best, Michael Beschloss put it this way, that this is truly a brilliant book, is a masterpiece of reporting, revelations, and analysis. Congratulations to you, and also congratulations to the fact that it is on the New York Times bestseller list. Well done, well done.
Well, thank you, Paula, and great to be back here with you. We've had a lot of years over the years when you were a government official, and of course, much of the work we've done together since. So it's great to be having this conversation with you. It was a fun book to write.
Well, clearly, because the inside story on so many issues, and we're going to delve into that. Let me start with maybe the main broad question, and that's the question of how did this new Cold Wars actually come about here? And by the way, maybe I should also, before you answer that, actually just say here, it really describes it well in the cover. Your book focuses on 3 decades after the end of the Cold War. The United States finds itself in a volatile rivalry with the other 2 great nuclear powers, Xi Jinping's China and Vladimir Putin's Russia, in a world far more complex and dangerous than it was a half-century ago. So the question is, how did these Cold Wars start?
Well, Paula, that wasn't the plan. The plan was pretty simple. The plan was that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, people were proclaiming the end of history. You remember the famous Francis Fukuyama article, but Fukuyama was not the only one making that case, that liberal democracy was going to reign supreme, that China and Russia, each for very different reasons, because they are such very different societies, was going to find it in their own national interest to rejoin or join for the first time Western institutions, whether it was the World Trade Organization or whether it was joining up with the European Union in the case of Russia. There was even discussion for a while that Russia might become a member of NATO, the alliance that was designed and built to contain the old Soviet Union, the predecessor state for Russia. So the idea was that we were all going to live in this sort of peaceful harmony. And for the first 10 years, it looked like that might happen because China was on a very slow road to democratization, but certainly was investing in its people, and China's growth turned into the world's greatest anti-poverty program. Russia was in halting democratization, filled with corruption, filled with all kinds of problems, but there was hope. And so what the book tries to do is trace the 5 presidents I've covered back to President Clinton, and their common belief across party lines that the U.S., China, and Russia would find areas of common interest where they could work together, whether it was climate or non-proliferation, containing Iran's nuclear program, trying to get North Korea to give up its nuclear program. All projects on which the powers work together. And we overinterpreted that activity as if it was a sign that they were all going to fit within this Western-based rule system, which over time they had no interest in doing. And after 150 pages of taking you through how we deceived ourselves that that was where this was going, what happened when the reality crashed into the Biden administration, with Russia going to war in Ukraine and with China emerging as a far more aggressive representation of its old self, one that wants to be the dominant political, military, technological power by the middle of this century.
You know what's amazing about the book, and you mentioned your recounting all of this evolution of policy over 5 presidential administrations. I mean, you've had 5 presidential administrations, your engagement with the White House and interviews and covering the White House. But not only that, the intelligence agencies and also technology companies as part of this. So the reservoir of information that you have amassed here truly is a masterpiece. And seriously, when I was reading it, I really felt, my gosh, I'm back in the sit room, or I'm back on the phone during a crisis. So let me go to the question, what did we do wrong here? Let's go over some of this, because you've said that, you know, over 30 years we were deluding ourselves about Russia, about China. What were we deluding ourselves about, and what big signals did we miss?
Well, we were deluding ourselves with the general proposition that they would let their economic interests overrun their territorial interests, their efforts at consolidating power. They would decide in the end that an open society was going to be more productive than a closed one. And this delusion was really at its most extreme with Russia. So you asked, what signals did we miss? And the book tries to walk you through some of them. So starting with Russia, President Bush, in whose administration you served, I think
George W. Bush.
George W. Bush wanted very much to bring Russia and China into the counterterrorism program as soon as 9/11 ended. And there's a scene early in the book, it's in chapter 1, where we're in St. Petersburg in 2002. It's early summer, so it's when the sun is, doesn't set till 10:30 or 11 and then barely sets and pops right back up. Bush and his wife Laura, Putin and his then wife were floating down the Neva River on this big party boat, essentially, big yacht. Dinner is being served by this hulking man standing in the back. We were trying to figure out, I remembered his presence, but didn't know at the time who he was. Of course, we later suspected that it was Yevgeny Prigozhin, and my wonderful co-writer and researcher, Mary Brooks, went back and found the photos, and sure enough, there's Prigozhin back in the days when he's still the chef, before he ran the Internet Research Agency to try to fix the 2016 election, before he founded the Wagner Group, to a mercenary military group that saved Russia in the early days of the Ukraine war, and of course, before he marched on Moscow. During the course of that cruise down the river, they talked about Russia joining the European Union. Bush and Putin on that trip and other trips met Russian and American students, and they were joking back and forth. You know how many meetings there were between Bush and Putin? We went back and counted. More than 24. You know how many there have been between Joe Biden and Putin? 1. And there will probably never be another. It was in June of 2021, before the invasion
By
in
the
Geneva.
way, to stick in that, we will be talking about Russia and China. The number of meetings between Putin and Xi, actually, I believe now the count is something like over 50,
That's
or at
right.
least 50.
That's right.
So,
And there were 40 before COVID, when, as we were.
but we'll come to that.
We will come to that. So that was the early setup. And do I think that Putin at the time had decided to go off in his own direction? I'm not sure he had yet. But by 2007, just 5 years after that float down the river, he showed up at the Munich Security Conference, February of 2007, and gave this hardline speech in which he said, there are parts of Russia, of Mother Russia, of the Russia of Peter the Great, that have been wrested from us and must now come back together. And Bob Gates was there, who of course had served as CIA chief. By this time he was defense secretary. He would stay on as Obama's defense secretary for a year or two. And he stood up and said at the end of this, this speech sounded like it was right out of the old Cold War. And he said, I lived through the whole Cold War, and frankly, I'm not eager to go do it again. And a succession of presidents from Bush on forward have said, we're not going back to the Cold War. And in fact, they're right. We're not. We're going into something that is a whole lot more complex, thus the title, New Cold Wars. 2007 was followed 7 years later by the Russian decision to take over Crimea. It took a year, Paula, for the United States and its allies to put together sanctions for that. And that only after the Russians shot down that airplane over Crimea. And then 7 years after that, he does the build-up to take the rest of Ukraine. So we had plenty of signals along the way. We chose not to interpret them in the worst possible way, because the idea was you can steer Putin back. So when Putin did the cyber attacks on the Pentagon, the White House, and the State Department, the Obama administration didn't want to admit it was Russia. I would sit in these interviews. I was looking at the code. They were looking at the code. It was clearly from Russian intelligence. They wouldn't say so. Right? The Trump administration, to its credit, began to attribute these attacks to either Russia or China or Iran, whoever they could attribute it to.
Well, in fact, let me inject. The Trump administration, when it came in that December, the very first year it was in, actually issued a national security strategy document. And in it, it said we're in an era of a great power competition.
That's right.
And it focused on Russia, it focused on China, and the points that you are making. Now, interestingly enough, all right, Biden, in their national security strategy document that they've issued, they put in that we are in an era of confrontation, but they focus on cooperation. So give your view on those. How do those documents fit in?
So the national security strategy, which is mostly read by a community of people in Washington and academics, but it's important because it's a signal to the government about where one's priorities are. When H.R. McMaster came in as the second national security advisor to Trump, he went through 4. He was determined to go write a national security strategy that would reorient the U.S. government away from years of counterterrorism and toward great power competition, what he called revisionist and revanchist regimes. Now, my only complaint about that national security strategy is I think it dealt with Russia and China as too similar than different, but that's a small point. He was absolutely right to go steer this in a new direction. Now, that didn't help much when the president went out to announce the strategy, because it's Donald Trump. He hadn't sat to read it because he's Donald Trump. And he went out and he gave a speech in the Rose Garden that bore no resemblance to the strategy that he was putting out. Okay, which the usual problem, which was that the staff work on Russia and China, some of it was excellent, and the execution, because the president couldn't carry through, was incredibly poor. Move forward to the Biden administration. They adopted a lot of that strategy. They do talk about areas of cooperation. The strategy came out before the invasion of Ukraine. They've dropped the cooperative kind of thought about Russia. They have not with China. But I think the overall message of those strategies, and certainly the message of new Cold Wars, is that we are in an era now of what will probably be decades of superpower confrontation. That if we are lucky, the new Cold Wars will stay cold. There is no guarantee. The old Cold War, had a literally explosive beginning. The United States and the Soviet Union became nuclear powers, China in the early 60s. And then it had a long middle, and it had this surprise ending in which our greatest adversary, the Soviet Union, collapsed of its own accord. Anybody who's looking for an equally happy, sort of easy end to this new set of confrontations, I think they're in for a disappointment. Because one of the differences now is that while the old Cold War was primarily a military and largely a nuclear confrontation with one adversary, we now have China and Russia coming together in a partnership that they describe as one with no limits. The book describes it as one with serious limits. But it is a partnership nonetheless. And we have never confronted a situation in which our two major nuclear adversaries are truly working together. In fact, the essence of what Kissinger and Nixon did in the early 70s in the recognition of China was to keep these two apart.
Let me, on your comparison on the national security strategy, during Trump and then in terms of the one released by Biden, one challenge I'd make to you is, I think some might say to you that in terms of the first one, that it was executed in terms of defense, the line that Reagan had, peace through strength, that our defenses were bolstered, and also the fact of the kind of signals that were sent in terms of policies like the establishment of actually a kind of fort, if you will, or forward deployment in Europe because of concern of Russian aggression, that actually there were concrete, tangible actions that provided a deterrent. So they would challenge that, well, it may not have been well executed. Some would say that it was executed in terms of actions, so not words
there were some,
and what was said, but actions.
So there were some very helpful actions, including, as you suggest, building up NATO, giving some defensive weapons to Ukraine that the Obama administration had refused to give.
The javelins.
The javelins, which, I mean, today seems pretty modest compared to what we've had to go give the Ukrainians now. The problem that they ran into, Paul, was that for every step forward, having that rotating group of NATO troops that would go into Eastern Europe and
Poland,
have a good presence there, you would have the president step out and undercut the American commitment to defend Europe, and he would not utter a reference to Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which requires, all countries to come to the aid of any under attack. And this was part of his obsession about whether Europe was spending enough money. And he was right on the point. Europe needed to spend more, and I would argue needs to spend wildly more now than it did then. But the result was that while at the lower levels they were doing the right steps, he was undercutting the unity of the NATO alliance by talking about how NATO was irrelevant, NATO was outdated, questioning whether the U.S. would try to pull out of NATO if you read John Bolton's memoir, they had to talk him out of the U.S. pulling out of NATO on more than one occasion.
Well, I think the part was because of the monies and the fact that the United States was doing the lion's shares. And as we know, every administration, Republican or Democrat, up to that point actually tried to push Europe, and he brought it to the brink to really get them to move. But let's go on. Angela Merkel, Nord Stream. You have to mention Nord Stream too, because you mentioned the Munich speech, Putin's speech. You even mentioned about, yes, Crimea.
Right. So Crimea is 2014, okay? We don't do sanctions. Then finally they come up with some modest sanctions that I don't think made a whole lot of difference. 2015, the year after he annexes Crimea, Angela Merkel negotiates the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It routes around Ukraine, thus depriving the Ukrainians of the revenue they were getting from the original Nord Stream pipeline. And she declares that Russia is a reliable supplier. And it's a remarkable statement out there now. So what she's essentially saying is, yeah, he's done all this bad stuff, but he's not going to cut us off because it's in his economic interest. And that moderated everything that the Germans were willing to go do to push back on Russia. And, you know, I was living in Germany for a couple of months at the end of last year and the beginning of this, just as I was getting the book finished. I was on assignment there for the Times. And one of the remarkable things is I think a good number of Germans think that we are going back at some point. We're going to resolve Ukraine one way or another, a negotiated settlement, give them some land, whatever it's going to be, and that they would return to this partial embrace of Russia, get the oil and gas flowing again, and that basically make Russia, make Europe secure by embracing Russia. I don't think that's happening again, and neither does the German sort of elite and government officials, but they can't bring themselves to publicly talk about the kind of money they're going to need to spend on defense. I mean, we've all been discussing, 2% of GDP, which was the standard that NATO set for itself, and the one that the President Trump used to refer to as their dues. It's not quite dues, but anyway, setting that aside, my guess is that if they are going to match their own rhetoric of what they are going to build up in the way of a serious military deterrent, they're probably talking about spending 4 or 5% of GDP, something you cannot utter in European politics today.
We still have a lot to cover. I want to go to your chapter, The Meltdown, and the focus on Afghanistan, because also in terms of chronology and leading up to Ukraine and what happened in Ukraine. Talk about this. What was, in your terms, the meltdown and what happened?
So the president had made no secret when he was vice president that he thought the United States needed to reduce, if not pull out of Ukraine.
President Biden, and then Vice President Biden.
Right, then Vice President. In the 2016 election, you could count on like 2 fingers the number of things that Joe Biden and Donald Trump agreed upon. But Afghanistan and getting out was one of them, right? So it was pretty clear the United States was going to get out. We only had at that point 2,500 troops that were left. The Pentagon was arguing for keeping them there as a sort of early warning system, a tripwire, and to maintain the intelligence gathering about where the Taliban were, how quickly they were moving back in, and to keep a counter-ISIS program going, because ISIS was the common enemy of the United States, Russia. Just think about the ISIS attack in Russia a few months ago, and of course even of Iran, right? The president made a decision in April to pull out all the troops based on the accord that the Trump administration had reached with the Taliban. And President Trump, you may recall, at Christmas time in his last months in office, declared one day in a tweet, all the troops are coming out in the next few weeks. He had no plan to do it, but he just announced it. Got talked back from that by his own staff. My critique in the book of the Biden administration is that having decided in April to do that, they did not rev up a plan to get out those Afghans who had helped the United States, who had helped news organizations, had helped the military. They should have been airlifting them out of Bagram or gathering them in a place that the Taliban could not get them. And of course, when it turned out the American intelligence turned out to be wrong, the Afghan military collapsed, it was clear that they had operated way too late. It was a disaster. Obviously, 13 Americans died. They had already closed Bagram Air Base early, so they had no way to sort of gather everybody in a big protected base and get them out. As searing as I am in the book, the after-action reports that have been written by some of the inspectors general, including the special Afghan inspector general, is even more searing. The one good thing that came out of it was I think that this was their equivalent of what happened to Kennedy during the Bay of Pigs, a mess-up so important and so big early in the administration that it actually brought together the whole group, and I think it helps explain why they did so much better a few months later in the early warnings and the public warnings about the run-up to the Ukraine war.
So do you think that we pushed Putin to invade Ukraine? Segueing, because some connect what happened in Afghanistan as a signal to Putin, one of the signals. The signal of not giving the javelins and the aid earlier on in 2014, and then Afghanistan, and then also just even when the tanks were lined up on the Ukrainian border. That
in April of 2021,
exactly.
Right after Biden came in.
Correct.
So Biden and Putin met, as I said, one time. It was in Geneva in 2021. And that meeting was not largely about Ukraine. That meeting was about Colonial Pipeline and the cyber attacks, the ransomware attacks that were proving so devastating. Remember, they had taken out a pipeline company that fed gasoline, jet fuel, all the way up and down the East Coast. There were gas lines at a time of plenty. Ukraine did come up in the meeting. Later on, I had some members of the administration tell me that their fear is that Putin came out of that Geneva meeting thinking Biden is so preoccupied with problems at home, January 6th, the ransomware stuff, getting out of Afghanistan, the economic recovery, which at that time was still pretty tenuous. It's since, blossomed pretty nicely for Biden, but he had no way of knowing that then, that he would have no stomach for getting the United States and NATO together to oppose a Ukraine invasion. Now, Putin got that wrong. Biden did rally NATO to come together, found a way to do it without committing U.S. or NATO troops, and poured a lot more resources into Ukraine than I think, and intelligence help and so forth, than Putin thought possible. But I do think that Afghanistan contributed to Putin's thought that the U.S. would not, in the end, get in the way here.
By the way, you mentioned what happened with Colonial. Let me quote this. You stated, quote, "Hours before the war began, demonstrated how radically different this new era was from wars past and from the Cold War. You refer to, quote, the digital war could spread much more quickly and change the dynamic, turning a war against Ukraine into a war against NATO." Explain that.
Sure. So a lot of people think that this war has been completely the physical one you're seeing on the screen. But it has also been a digital one. In fact, there's a place early in the book where I quote Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And I'll clean up the language here because we're on a nice C-SPAN broadcast. But
you
he
have
basically
some great quotes in this book, I have to say.
Right.
It's outstanding research, really.
So Milley said to me one day over lunch, he said, David, he said, at first we thought this was going to be a pure cyber war, because Russia had gone after Ukraine with cyber attacks that turned off the power many times. He said, then we thought it was a World War II style tank war. And then we thought it was a blanking World War I trench war, And the reality is it's been all three. So in the days before the attack started, the Russians took out Viasat, which is the European satellite network that the Ukrainians depended on, okay? And they took it out without ever attacking the satellites in space. They did a pretty brilliant cyber attack on the modems on the ground that fried enough of those that the communications with the satellites went out. Then, in the 24 hours before the war, Microsoft, and the book takes you into the Microsoft Center in just outside of Dulles Airport here in Washington, detected that the Russians had activated malware that was being used to basically take offline all of the Ukrainian government agencies. And there was a remarkable rush by Microsoft and by Amazon systems to take the Ukrainian government and put it in the cloud. It required a legal change that happened overnight in Ukraine because they realized that all of the Ukrainian data on everything from pension payments to healthcare plans to how the military communicates to the leadership's communications were sitting in servers around Kyiv that were sitting ducks for missile attacks. And by moving it into the cloud, it assured that when those centers got destroyed, and they were destroyed within weeks, Ukraine could keep running. That didn't happen in the Cold War.
That's absolutely correct. And also, the fact that you document this in the book is so crucial because it's not a fact that's focused on and really focused on. It's not only about the tanks and, if you will, the ground warfare. But that's why I read this quote of yours, because the digital war. What's different in the new Cold Wars?
Well, one of the things that saved them was Elon Musk. And we all have issues about Elon Musk, okay? I'm not a big fan of what he did with Twitter. But had he not brought Starlink units into Ukraine, they would have no way to communicate with that cloud or ultimately to target their own military hardware, right? They're not hitting these ships that are the Russian ships off Crimea because they've got remarkable vision across the sea. They're doing it because they've got the Starlink communications. And it has been an amazing laboratory for the U.S. military, which has suddenly discovered that these $5 billion satellites that we put up are sitting ducks, and they need something much more like Starlink, which puts up thousands of small satellites in these constellations that can repair themselves.
Absolutely. You do have some wonderful quotes in this book, and this enables me to segue to the China-Russia relationship. First, the Bill Burns quote, "Who lost Russia? It's an old argument, and it misses the point. Russia was never ours to lose." Just starting with that backdrop, really just on point. And then, in the chapter where you do focus on the relationship and what is it, it's interesting. Kurt Campbell, who's now Deputy Secretary of State, he said it's not a marriage of convenience. That term has been used. He calls it a coalition of the aggrieved. Now, that term I found quite interesting. There have been those that have used alignment. In fact, if I may say, I wrote a piece with Steve Hadley, and we use the word a new alignment. Mm-hmm. There are others who are using the word alliance. How do you see it? Describe how this relationship has evolved.
So first of all, I don't think there's unanimity inside the Biden administration about how to describe, much less respond to, the Russia-China relationship. Certainly, they have come together in all kinds of ways. Secretary Blinken was just in China, and he said publicly what we've all reported and known, which is the Chinese are moving huge amounts of technology, not weapons, but dual-use technology to Russia. They are continuing to buy Russian oil. They're not the only ones. The Indians are buying Russian oil, right? Which is helping finance the war. They are meeting on all kinds of other strategic issues. They're doing military exercises together. And both of them have developed a relationship with Iran. Iran is supplying Russia with the Shahed drones that are being used so effectively against Ukraine. There is concern that Iran will provide missiles. We are already seeing the North Koreans provide both artillery and some missiles to the Russians for this. Now, half of them don't work because they're North Korean, but half of them do, okay? So I think that Kurt Campbell's statement there about the coalition of the aggrieved is a really good description of what they are, because the one thing that unifies them is their grievance about the United States and its allies. Because what is our single greatest strength as we enter this new era of new Cold Wars? It is our alliance network, which the Russians don't have, the Chinese don't have, the Iranians don't have. And that's the single most precious power projection capability that we've got. And it used to be at the core of Republican as well as Democratic orthodoxy. Now we've seen the Republican Party split on the question of the value of these alliances.
You use the term partnership without limits. And a core question really is, can we expect that both are going to deepen their partnership to undercut U.S. power, U.S. dominance? Will that continue? Are we going to see that deepening?
I suspect that we will. It's not going to be without tension. Look, in the old Cold War, whenever the Russians showed up in China, the Soviet Union was the top dog there, and the Chinese were still an agrarian society. That dynamic has been flipped. When Vladimir Putin shows up to see Xi Jinping, or when Xi goes to Moscow, it is clear that the dominant player right now is China. It's got the cash, it has the strategic reach, it's got the depth. Putin needs the Chinese more than the Chinese need Putin. But Putin serves an enormously useful role for the Chinese, which is the more he keeps the United States tied up in Ukraine, the more that the Mideast blows up, some of it with Russian help, particularly in Syria, the more the United States is incapable of exercising the pivot to Asia that every president since Bill Clinton has talked about and that has never really been fully executed on.
So, Sputnik moment, really fascinating chapter. And let's go to this and draw you out on specifics. You have actual detailed conversations with General Hyten referenced in there. And this is the issue of the Chinese hypersonic missile test. Breathe life into that chapter. Let's share that, because it was very, I mean, that just jumped off the pages.
So Hyten was the former head of the units within the U.S. government or the U.S. military at the time,
the Supreme Command
that had watched over Space Command. Right. It was not yet the U.S. Space Force, and then he became vice
U.S.
chairman.
Strategic Command.
That's right.
The commander.
He ran Strategic Command, which of course runs nuclear weapons, but also has a lot of interest in the space assets. And then he became the vice chairman. One day he's sitting in his office. He gets a phone call from the Defense Department's main operations center, which runs 24/7 deep underneath the Pentagon. And they said, "Sir, we've seen a really unusual Chinese launch." And it turned out it was a missile launch. He said, "Well, there are missile launches all the time." He says, "Yeah, but this one's going in the wrong direction." Okay. Normally missiles are launched in one direction, mostly toward the east. This was going in the reverse, and it was because it was the first detailed demonstration of a Chinese hypersonic capability that we did not know existed. They looped all the way around the Earth, went over the United States, and then basically the hypersonic vehicle managed to go station itself in a place where it could then move in an erratic pathway, not the easy parabola of an intercontinental ballistic missile, and it landed back inside China. And the Pentagon was stunned. This leaked out later on to the Financial Times, and they wrote the first stories about it. And at that moment, General Milley said this should be a Sputnik moment for the United States. In other words, referring to the satellite launch that the Soviets had done, back in the 50s. And he was saying it should basically bring about a reaction of some kind. I'm not sure it turned out to be that way. And there is still a lot of debate inside the Pentagon about how much effort they need to put into hypersonics. But what did it make clear? That the decades that we have put into missile defenses were basically wasted because they all are based on a nice, easy parabola coming from the Soviet Union into the United States or from North Korea into the United States. Our missile defenses have never been able to handle more than a few missiles. But at the moment that you go hypersonic and you can have a missile that can move on an unusual path and come down in close to the ground and below radar areas and all that, it's game over for our existing missile defenses.
And as you called it, the Sputnik moment.
That's right.
Well called it. Let me ask you the question of going 30 years back. All right, let's say that decision makers had embraced your analysis and they're on the exact same page that you are on now. So at that moment, first of all, what would the policy have been then?
Sure.
Okay, and then B, would it have been both politically and bureaucratically feasible?
So the political hard part here was that every one of these presidents, Democratic and Republican, Clinton and Bush and Obama and Trump, they all had to live in the hope that you could avoid, using diplomatic and trade means, having a collision with Russia and China, and certainly having one that was simultaneous. So you can't fault them for attempting to build up as good a relationship as possible. But you can fault them for two things. And this is a bipartisan complaint I have, and I'd be interested in your reaction to it because you were in the State Department at the time some of this was going on. First, we paid a very serious price for focusing so on counterterrorism and the Middle East for 20 years. You remember these days in the State Department, if you were going to get promoted as a diplomat, you had to spend your time in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was just, it was the unspoken rule. In the military, you certainly did, because it was the only way you were going to get battle experience and, thus the commendations, the awards and so forth that would put you on a rise. So we ended up getting a generation of diplomats and particularly of military leaders whose whole experience had been in managing the counterterrorism wars, which required a completely different set of talents than dealing with the economic rise of China or a revanchist, a Russia that was once again becoming aggressive and willing to risk a full-scale war in Europe. And so the book argues that one of the prices we paid for the counterterrorism wars was a lack of attention on the area that would become the central challenges to the United States for the next half century.
And the signals that you lay out. So my answer would be we ignored the signals. We should have been paying attention to the signals. We should have been able to do both. Quite frankly, we overreached on the other.
If you're going to be a superpower, you've got to be able to go maintain a regional presence and still keep your focus on your big competitors. and we failed at doing both simultaneously.
Do you think it was inevitable, this Chinese-Russian, alignment? I'm going to use that term, the Chinese-Russian alignment. Was it inevitable it would happen? Because historically, they, as we know, have had tensions.
They have. They've had a lot of them. And inevitable, no. Likely enough that we had to begin to think about how we would plan against it? Yes, because now it's probably too late to interrupt it in any serious way. So I mentioned before that Nixon and Kissinger had sort of focused on preventing this by doing the recognition of China. And for nearly half a century, that worked out pretty well. I discussed this some with Kissinger in the last months of his life, because I was at work on what became the New York Times obituary for Kissinger, which was not as long as this book, but felt like it was at various moments. Fascinating life. And he was concerned that this coming together of Putin and Xi was undoing much of his lifetime work. Interesting question of whether or not the United States could have gotten in the way. I think that President Trump would have told you that his trade deal that he pursued so heavily with China would have been a way toward that. I actually don't think it would have. I think the Chinese thought they could have their trade deals with the United States and their alignment with Russia. Interesting question now is, are there things we can do to exploit those natural fissures in their interests that you mentioned? And what I worry is we're not debating that in this current presidential campaign. We are so wrapped up in the internal divisions of the United States, in arguments over social issues, whether it is Black Lives Matter or abortion, or you pick your hot button issue. But if you go back and you listen, Paula, to, it's a fun experiment, to the Nixon-Kennedy debates from 1960. So turn off the video so you're not focused on who looks young and who looks sweaty and all that, and just listen to the conversation. It's an incredibly high-level, sophisticated conversation about the containment of the Soviet Union. Absolutely. And how you go about doing it. And they had Absolutely. Two very different approaches, okay? And for another episode, another time, we can argue about whose approach might have been better or worse. Can you imagine having that conversation in the current political environment in the United States? You can't, in part because of our own divisions, in part because we took a 30-year holiday from strategic discussion, because we didn't think it was necessary at a time that America was the sole power out there. And now suddenly we need to do it, and we've kind of lost the skills. So we have to learn how to get back on the bicycle and learn how to ride it again.
But 30 years ago, you would say that it was politically feasible and maybe even bureaucratically feasible.
I think it would have been politically difficult because we were, and the political difficulty is, we were showing some early progress. We negotiated through the Nunn-Lugar money, the billions of dollars that went to dismantling part of the old Soviet nuclear infrastructure, so that fuel was blended down and burned off in nuclear power plants in the middle of the country. So people were reading their kids' bedside stories at night under lights that were basically being fueled by old Soviet nuclear weapons. That's pretty great. But we then convinced ourselves that was going to be the uninterrupted path of our future.
So the question is, will Xi invade Taiwan? That's one of the questions that you actually pose for yourself in the book. Will he or won't he?
So we spent a lot, Mary Brooks and I spent a lot of time in Taiwan for the research on this book. And we spent most of it not with the government, but at Taiwan Semiconductor, this incredible gem that dominates the island now, and certainly dominates its economy. Taiwan Semiconductor is the producer of 90 to 95% of all the most advanced semiconductors produced in the world. They're what power the microprocessor at the core of your iPhone. So if China invades Taiwan, don't break your iPhone, Paula. Okay? It's going to be really a long time before you can replace it.
I had the advantage of going to Taiwan and actually seeing those very buildings where these chips are made.
It's really great. And the fabs are amazing,
Yes.
right? But the problem is that we have consolidated so much of the world's chip-making operations in these highly vulnerable buildings. So the question that we went to Taiwan to answer was, is there a silicon shield? In other words, since China needs those chips as well as we do, would they not invade Taiwan because they couldn't afford to lose Taiwan Semiconductor? And to cut to the chase, the conclusion I came to was, for now, there is a silicon shield. But China is working really hard to build up its capability to make those most sophisticated chips. The Biden administration has executed quite well, I think, a program to deprive the Chinese of the equipment needed to make the most sophisticated chips and to deprive them of the chips themselves that come out of Taiwan Semiconductor. And that's what Xi Jinping spends most of his time complaining about to President Biden, which tells you that they've gotten under his skin with this. I think we've bought some time. What I worry about is we're not using it well enough. You know, President Biden is running around the country every time there is a new semiconductor plant to go dedicate. He was just up at one in upstate New York. He's been to Arizona, where Taiwan Semiconductor and Intel and others are building in the Southwest. My concern is we're not building our capacity up fast enough that we will not have to be reliant on Taiwan or China.
And then another question that you do pose, and this is, I'll cite it, will the mistakes that Putin made in his invasion of Ukraine prove to be his undoing, leading him to reach into his nuclear arsenal, or will the West's short attention span signal Kiev's doom?
So let's take the nuclear arsenal part of this first. Milley had this great phrase, General Milley, which was that we are faced with the nuclear paradox that the worse the Russians do in Ukraine, the more likely their nuclear use. The better they do, the least likely their nuclear use. And the high point of the concern that they were going to use nuclear weapons, and I tell the story in the book, came in October of 2022, when the U.S. picked up intercepts from Russian generals who were responsible for moving nuclear weapons around, battlefield tactical nuclear weapons. And it was clear that they were discussing moving some of these into Ukraine for possible use against Ukrainian military targets. It would have been the first use of nuclear weapons since the day the United States dropped a bomb on Nagasaki. And this sent a panic throughout the Biden administration. There was an evening when President Biden shows up at the New York townhouse of James Murdoch for a fundraiser. It's a member of the Murdoch family, but probably the only Democratic fundraiser within the Murdoch family. And everybody who's milling around looking at Murdoch's spectacular art collection is thinking to themselves, well, this is going to be a nice, evening cocktail. I can say I had cocktails with the president. And he comes in and he says, we are facing the closest we've ever been to a nuclear exchange since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which was 60 years to the week before when Biden was speaking. And he went on to describe not the intelligence, but the problem that we faced. I think most Americans were clueless that we were in the middle of a nuclear crisis. They did get China and India to quietly signal to the Russians and to Putin that there was no room for nuclear use in this conflict. And after a number of weeks, the crisis abated. But many who I interviewed think that we were at a sort of 50-50 point about nuclear use at that moment. That's pretty chilling, because here was a nuclear-armed country thinking about using a nuclear weapon against a non-nuclear country.
We have a few minutes to go, and I just want to ask just a very precise question. So what's your core message for this book? Summing it up in 1 minute.
The core message for this book, Paula, is we are in a new age that has some similarities to the old Cold War, but is much more volatile, much more dangerous because of this combination of Russia and China and some of the outsiders who are there. That we have not absorbed this as a body politic and begun to think or debate the strategies needed to go counter it because we are so wrapped up in our own problems. There is a huge narcissism to American politics, as there are to many countries' politics. But we have to regain our strategic edge here. And that means thinking about a future in which this set of confrontations is the one we're going to have to manage for decades to come.
David, congratulations, a hearty congratulations on this fantastic, truly, as I used before the term masterpiece, I repeated it, a masterpiece of reporting, revelations, and analysis. It really is an amazing read. David Sanger's New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. It's a terrific, terrific read. Thank you for coming today for this interview, David.
Thank you, Paula. Great to be with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.